So 2023 is now in full swing, and really the 2020s themselves are in full swing as we enter the fourth year of what has admittedly been kind of a weird decade. But as we continue to roar on with the 20s, the 2010s will continue to slip further away, and in turn all of the games that came out during that era will start to become a little bit hazy in terms of whether we look at them as modern games, or if they've slowly started to inch their way over the line into retro territory. So considering January is an ideal time to look both forward and back as we start another lap around the sun, today what I thought I would do is talk about some great games from the 2010s that play really well on the deck, and really are just great games in their own right. And let's go ahead and kick this off with a game that came out right near the end of the 2010s as a 2019 release that won multiple Game of the Year awards, and that is Sekiro. From Software, Sekiro will always hold a special place in my heart. Not just because it's a brutally difficult Soulsian challenge with a shinobi aesthetic, but also because it took heavy inspiration from the Tenchu series, which was my first foray into the stealth action genre way back in like 1998. In fact, the devs briefly considered developing Sekiro as another entry in the Tenchu series, but ultimately it became its own thing, which was probably for the best. In Sekiro you'll play as Wolf, a shinobi bodyguard to a young lord from whom you've become separated, and it's your job to get him back. And in so doing you'll embark on a truly epic adventure, and that is not a word that I like to throw around lightly. But believe me, Sekiro more than earns all of its critical acclaim, and as long as you don't mind one of the stiffest challenges in gaming history, I highly recommend it. Especially if you're looking for a Souls-like with a greater emphasis on speed and aggression. Because much like Bloodborne before it, you will rarely be looking to shield up in combat, rather you'll be dodging and countering through deflection to find openings in your opponent's defenses. It's definitely a high-risk, high-reward style of combat that can require some razor-sharp timing. But if you're willing to put in the time, you will find some of the most rewarding combat that I've seen in any action RPG. Play on the Steam Deck is fairly smooth, though no matter what combination of graphic settings I tried to tweak, I couldn't really get it to hit a rock-solid 60. Playing on medium or high settings while locking the frame and refresh rates to 40 performed very well though, and as someone who spent a lot of initial time playing on console at 30 FPS, the deck is certainly capable enough for the task. Next up, moving further back into the last decade around 2017, this is a bit of a cheat because it did technically arrive on PC in the 2010s, however it is a port of a game that originally came out in Japan in 2009 before making its way to the US on the 360 and PS3 in 2010, and that is Bayonetta. I remember being so pumped for this game to come out during its original release. It looked like exactly the sort of B-movie action romp that I loved during that era, and I still love it today. But make no mistake, its combat still stands tall as one of the best action games ever made, and of course it has style for days. Taking place in the fictional European city of Vigrid, you'll step into the heels of Bayonetta, a shape-shifting witch who uses a variety of firearms and magical attacks, in addition to using her hair to summon demons to do her bidding in the heat of battle. Much like the oft-compared Devil May Cry, it also features a rating system that judges your performance in each skirmish, constantly pushing you to mix up your attacks and combos to maximize style and in turn damage. And while some players took umbrage with its heavy use of QuickTime events, honestly they never really stopped me from having a great time with it. And in 2023 that's still the case. It's chock full of schlocky, over-the-top grindhouse fun, so if that's your cup of tea, Bayonetta still delivers almost 15 years later. Now make no mistake, even though the combat feels as tight and rewarding as it ever has, you can definitely feel some 15-year-old design trends here even beyond the QuickTime events. Some cutscenes are fully animated, while others are just stylishly edited still frame sequences with a voiceover. It's also arranged episodically, so it's not like you'll be playing in one continuous sequence like a lot of modern action games. But if you've always had a fondness for high-octane action that is, uniquely stylized, Bayonetta still has it where it counts. Deck performance is predictably solid, holding a steady 60 frames per second without breaking a sweat with the graphics option set to high, and controlling the on-screen action feels as silky smooth as it ever has. Although I did end up reversing the X-axis camera control since that's more in line with what I'm used to. But beyond that minor change, everything was ready to go as soon as I fired it up, and while it's unlikely we'll ever get to experience Bayonetta 2 and 3 on PC, the original still more than holds up and is definitely worth revisiting if it's been a while. Next up from 2013 is another action-heavy title, albeit one that is slightly slower than Bayonetta, but still a tremendously good time to play, and that is Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Shadow of Mordor bears special mention here not just because it's as fun to play now as it was when it first launched, but it also carries the special distinction of being one of the only licensed properties to transcend mediums and actually make for a great game. Don't get me wrong, plenty of movies, shows, or comics sound like they'd make for a great time as a video game, but a lot of the time something gets fumbled in the execution, whether that's overloading a beloved property with microtransactions, failing to understand what makes the source material great, or just straight up phoning in the gameplay, and that's kind of been an issue for licensed games as far back as E.T. for the Atari. But Middle-earth sure did a whole lot right here. Now, I'm not enough of a Tolkien nerd to speak to every liberty taken in this original work set in Tolkien's universe, so I'll just say that it takes place between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. You'll be playing as a Gondorian ranger Talion who is bonded with the Wraith of Celebrimbor on a mission of vengeance. Just knowing that you're bonded with a Wraith is pretty rad in its own right, but the coolness factor ramps up considerably when you realize that in addition to the standard third-person action that you would expect from a title like this, you also get to use Celebrimbor's Wraith abilities to bust up a whole range of Uruks or just outright intimidate them for information as you continue to cleave through Sauron's ranks. That the developers were able to so competently build out an original Tolkien story in a gorgeous world with solid mechanics might have been enough on its own, but then on top of that they layered an entirely separate dynamic with the Nemesis system, where as you continue to thin out the legions of orcs you'll be battling, the war chiefs and captains you encounter will remember you from prior engagements and your tactics. That's not just fun mechanically, but narratively it's cool that rather than just cutting down boss after boss, you can actually have a sort of rivalry with a member of Sauron's forces as the story continues to unfold. Of all the slightly older games that I've played on the Steam Deck so far, this has to be one of the most enjoyable ones that I've jumped back into. The environments are richly detailed, and deck performance is more than solid. You can even set your graphical options up to Ultra and get pretty close to 60 FPS, although I opted for a smoother experience and put the options down to very high, which seemed to keep a mostly consistent 60. In a nutshell, just about everything about this title has aged pretty well, and it really was a blast returning to it for this video. So if you've ever wanted to expand your Tolkien experience but maybe assumed licensed games were probably garbage, I promise you this is a rare and delightful exception, particularly if you're a fan of the Arkham series flavor of combat. Next up, returning to a more modern setting is a game that might finally escape my backlog thanks to the Steam Deck, and honestly it should, because every time I mention this game I get an earful from fans who tell me that I just need to play it, and that is Spec Ops: The Line from 2012. Set in Dubai, Spec Ops: The Line has you stepping into the boots of Captain Walker and kicks off in the middle of the plot before Tarantinoing everything and putting you back at the beginning of the story. Walker, along with the rest of Delta Team, begin traversing a nearly buried Dubai in the midst of some brutal sandstorms for a recon mission to gather intel about Colonel John Conrad of the US Army and the 33rd Battalion who were assisting with relief efforts. Admittedly, I don't know much about the plot beyond that, and I don't want to know more about the plot beyond that because I'm experiencing it for the first time here. On the gameplay front, Spec Ops feels pretty solid even by today's standards, and I was pleasantly surprised at how good the various firearms felt. It's pretty standard stop-and-pop third-person shooter gameplay, but the unique setting and premise gripped me pretty quickly. Also, I really appreciate that while this game was released during the era where just about every game had that rust-colored grittiness about it, that it actually has some insane pops of color despite being set in one of the grittiest settings you could imagine, what with there being in a desert and all. On the deck I would say it performs reasonably well, but there were a few caveats. The first is that there seems to be some frame hitching whenever transitioning into a new cutscene or loading into a new area that you're headed toward. I tried adjusting the game's graphic settings individually, but couldn't really find a good combination to keep it at a universally consistent 60 frames per second. But honestly, even though it's noticeable, it didn't detract from the actual gameplay experience that much, since the frame rate stayed pretty solid whenever I was in the midst of a firefight, which is really what mattered most to me. I suppose I could always revisit this game on the PS3 or something, but it seemed appealing to me to play here the same way I was pumped to revisit Mad Max from a few months back. Ultimately, it's totally playable, but you might want to experiment with adjusting individual graphic settings or locking the frame and refresh rates to get a smoother experience. But graphic settings aside, if you're looking for a third-person shooter that's supposed to have a really gripping and surprising story, Spec Ops is at least worth a look. And last but certainly not least, the only 2D title on this list, and one that is brutally difficult that came out way back in 2010, Super Meat Boy. Much like Braid before it, Super Meat Boy was one of the earliest indie games that I played on the 360 back in 2010. It is a brutally difficult platformer where you control a red cube of meat named Meat Boy in a bid to save your girlfriend, Bandaged Girl, from the evil Dr. Fetus. Now that's definitely a unique setup, but that's probably to be expected from the same creator who made games like The Binding of Isaac or The End Is Nigh. But Super Meat Boy is a little bit more straightforward than the more cryptic Binding of Isaac. Stage after stage you'll be running and jumping and dodging a variety of stage hazards to complete your goal. And Meat Boy is fast, let me tell you. As fulfilling as it is to flip your way deftly to the end of a stage in just a few seconds on the first try, it's even more satisfying to fail a stage 20 times in a row, complete it, and then see your Meat Boy's ghost reattempt the entire thing behind you showing every time you failed all at once. Which, to be fair, that might sound daunting, but as soon as you die, you're pretty much immediately placed back at the beginning of the level, so there's a constant pull to try just one more time, even if a stage takes you a few dozen tries to nail down. Thankfully, all of the on-screen action feels airtight as you time your runs and jumps to avoid danger, and it doesn't miss a beat on the deck. I did no optimizations at all for this game and got a steady 60 frames per second with no problem at all, which honestly makes perfect sense because this isn't the sort of game that's going to tax the hardware in any significant way. But between its playful hand-drawn presentation and precise controls, it's a game that's easy to jump into for a few minutes or a few hours if you want to soak in some platforming chaos with retro sensibilities. Alright, so that's it for this one, and it was really fun going through my library and sorting it by release date for a change, and just kind of thinking back on when did that game actually come out, and, you know, what are some of the cooler games that I played in the 2010s, and do they still hold up today? But hey, what about you? Are there any games from that era that you would recommend, or maybe games that people just don't think of that often, you know, like hidden gems of sorts? If so, let me know in the comments below, because I would love to hear your thoughts and recommendations for the Steam Deck for, again, games from the 2010s. As always, thank you for hanging out on the channel, it really means a lot to me. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.